He stopped at the end of the road, then turned back like he'd forgotten something he couldn't afford to lose. Dust scraped across the boards as she gripped the edge of the step, knuckles pale, a worn suitcase pressed against her boot. A screen door slammed somewhere behind her. The man's footsteps came back, slow this time, not passing through, not leaving. His shadow stretched over her hands before his voice did, and for a second, no one spoke. Follow along if you want to see what he says next. Dust Creek, Texas, 1888. Carried its dust like a second skin. By late afternoon, the wind came low and steady, pushing fine red dirt along the main street, slipping through the gaps between weathered boards, settling into cuffs and collars and the corners of a man's eyes. The buildings stood tired and gray, sun-bleached and quiet, as if they had been holding their breath too long. Ruth Walker sat on the front step of the boarding house with her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. A small leather suitcase rested beside her boot. The handle was cracked. One corner had been stitched back together with thread that didn't quite match. It had seen more miles than she had meant to travel. Her dress had been neat once. Beige linen, simple cut. Now it carried the memory of train benches, roadside stops, and 2 nights without proper rest. Dust clung to the hem. Her shoes were coated in the same red earth as the street. Inside the doorway, the boarding house owner stood with a ledger tucked under his arm. He didn't step outside. Didn't need to. He tapped the book once with his finger. Tomorrow. That was all he said. Ruth gave a small nod. Not agreement, not protest. Just acknowledgement that the word had landed where it was meant to. The man lingered a second, as if expecting something more. Then he turned back into the dim hallway, the door creaking softly behind him. The street went on without her. A wagon rolled past, wheels grinding slow. 2 men stood near the general store, speaking low, their voices carried off in pieces by the wind. Somewhere farther down, a screen door slapped shut. Ruth watched none of it directly. Her eyes rested somewhere just beyond the road, unfocused, like she was still measuring a distance she hadn't finished crossing. She reached into her coat pocket and felt the coins there, not counting them. She already knew. A shadow fell across her boots. She looked up. A boy stood in front of her, close enough that she could see the freckles across his nose, the way his hair stuck out in uneven directions like it had argued with a comb and won. He didn't fidget, didn't glance away. "Why do you look like that?" he asked. His voice wasn't unkind, just plain. Ruth blinked once as if pulling herself back into the moment. She studied him the way you study something unexpected, but not unwelcome. "Like what?" she asked. "Like you got nowhere to go," he said. The words sat there between them, simple and exact. Ruth let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It didn't sound like much, just air. She lowered her eyes for a moment, then back to him. "I have no family left," she said quietly. The sentence didn't break. It didn't ask for anything. It simply existed. The boy took that in, the way children do without rushing to fix it. Behind him, a man's voice came. "Noah." The boy didn't move. "She looks like she needs help," he said, still watching Ruth. "People can need things that aren't ours to give," the man replied. Ruth lifted her gaze past the boy. The man stood a few steps back in the street. Tall, shoulders set from years of work that didn't ask permission. His shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbows, forearms marked with faint lines and sun. A hat sat low on his brow, shadowing his eyes. He held a small paper parcel in one hand, like he'd just come from the store. "Noah," he said again, softer this time. The boy hesitated, then stepped aside, but he didn't leave. A little girl stood near the man's side. Younger. Quiet. Her hand rested against the fabric of his coat, fingers curled just enough to show she was there without needing to say it. She watched Ruth with steady attention. Ruth straightened slightly where she sat. "I'm all right," she said. It came out easy. Practiced. Not quite true. The man looked at her then. Not quickly. Not sharply. Just long enough to see what was there. "All right," he said. He didn't argue it. He tipped his head once toward the boy. "Come on." Noah lingered a heartbeat longer. Then he turned, walking back toward the man, though he looked over his shoulder once before he reached him. The three of them moved down the street together. The girl kept close. The boy kicked a small stone ahead of him as he walked. Ruth watched them go. The man didn't look back. They reached the far end of the block. The wind shifted, lifting dust into the air between them. For a moment, the man slowed. It was slight, easy to miss. Then he kept walking. Ruth lowered her gaze to her hands again. She pressed her fingers together, as if holding something in place that might otherwise slip. The street settled back into its usual rhythm. A horse snorted somewhere nearby. A door opened, then closed. The sun edged lower, casting long shadows that stretched thin across the boards beneath her feet. Time moved, just not for her. At the end of the street, the man stopped. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't announced. He simply came to a halt, one hand resting at his side, the other still holding the parcel. The boy looked up at him. The girl shifted her weight. The man stood there for a second longer than made sense. Then he turned. Not quickly, not dramatically. Just a quiet pivot, like a decision that had taken longer than the motion itself. He started back the way he'd come. The dust rose again around his boots as he walked. Ruth didn't see it yet. She was still sitting on the step, still holding herself together in the same careful way. But the distance between where she was and where she had been a moment ago had already begun to change. She heard boots on the boards before she looked up, slow, measured, coming back. Ruth lifted her eyes. The man stood a few feet from her now, hat still low, the same parcel in his hand. Up close, the lines at the corners of his eyes showed clearer. Not soft lines, weather lines, the kind that stay. "This is yours," he said, holding out the parcel. Ruth didn't reach for it right away. "I didn't order anything," she said. "I know," he replied. That was all. A pause stretched between them. The wind slid past again, catching the edge of her sleeve. She took the parcel. It was still warm. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once, then stepped back. "Noah," he called, not raising his voice. The boy came at once this time. The girl followed, her small boots quiet against the dirt. They left again, but not the same way they had before. Ruth watched them until they turned the corner. That night came early. Dust Creek didn't carry much light after sunset. A few lanterns in windows, one outside the saloon. The rest was shadow and the sound of boards settling in the cool air. Ruth sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the parcel open beside her. Stew, simple. Potatoes, a bit of meat, carrots cut uneven. She ate slowly, not because she was full, but because she didn't want it gone too fast. There was a knock at the door, not loud, just enough. Ruth stood, smoothed her dress without thinking, and opened it. Noah stood there again. "Papa said you should keep the bowl," he said. Behind him, at the far end of the hallway, the man stood where the lantern light didn't quite reach him, leaning one shoulder against the wall, looking somewhere past her. "You can tell him I'll bring it back," Ruth said. Noah shook his head. "He said you won't." Ruth almost smiled. Almost. "Good night," the boy added, then turned before she could answer. The man didn't step forward, didn't speak. He gave a small nod that might have been meant for her, then pushed himself off the wall and followed the children down the hall. Ruth closed the door. She stood there for a moment, hand still on the handle. Then she set the bowl carefully on the small table by the window. Morning came with the sound of wagons and the smell of coffee drifting from somewhere down the street. Ruth was already dressed. She stepped out into the light, pulling her coat close against the cool that hadn't burned off yet. The boarding house owner didn't look at her as she passed. She walked the length of Dust Creek. The cafe turned her away with a quick shake of the head. The stable boy laughed without meanness, just habit. The general store clerk said they weren't hiring before she finished asking. At the far end of the street, she paused. A wooden sign creaked above a narrow shop. Carter Saddlery. Inside, the air smelled of leather and oil. An older man looked up from his workbench, tools laid out in careful order. "You looking to buy or mend?" he asked. "Work," Ruth said. He studied her hands, not her face, not her dress, her hands. "Ever stitch leather?" he asked. "No," she said, "but I learn quick." He grunted, not unkindly. "Come back next week," he said. "Maybe." It wasn't a promise, but it wasn't a no. Ruth nodded. "Thank you." She stepped back out into the sun. A familiar voice came from behind her. "You won't find much this week." She turned. The man stood there, hat tipped back just enough now to show his eyes. "Town's slow," he added. "End of season." Ruth folded her hands in front of her. "I gathered that." He shifted his weight, as if considering something. "I've got work," he said finally. She didn't answer right away. "It's not charity," he went on. "Fences need fixing. Kitchen could use someone who knows what they're doing. Kids need looking after now and then." Ruth held his gaze. "I get paid?" she asked. "Yes." "How much?" He named a number. Not generous, not insulting. "Fair." Ruth nodded once. "When do I start?" she asked. The man's mouth moved, just slightly, like something close to approval. "Tomorrow," he said. He turned, then paused. "Colt Blake," he added over his shoulder. "Ruth Walker," she said. He nodded, like he'd expected that. By the time he walked away, the dust had already begun to settle behind him. Ruth stood there a moment longer. Then she turned toward the boarding house, not because anything had been solved, but because, for the first time since she arrived, there was a direction to walk in. The Blake Ranch sat a mile outside Dust Creek, past a line of low mesquite and a gate that leaned just enough to show it had been fixed more than once. Ruth reached it early, the sun still low, light stretched thin across the fields. The ground was dry, not cracked yet, but thinking about it. Colt was already out there. He stood near the fence line with a hammer in one hand, checking a post that had shifted. He didn't wave when he saw her, just straightened and waited. "You found it," he said. "I said I would," she answered. He nodded once, like that was all that needed saying. The work was simple to explain and harder to finish. Loose boards, a gate that dragged, a kitchen that held more dust than use. Ruth moved through it without asking where things were. She looked once, then remembered. Noah followed her the first hour, talking about a horse that refused to take a bit. May stayed near the doorway, watching, her fingers working a knot in a piece of twine. By midday, the house felt different, not fuller, just set right. Colt noticed it without turning his head. "You've done this before," he said. Ruth wiped her hands on a cloth. "Most things." He accepted that. The first sign came in the afternoon. A rider passed slow along the road, not stopping, just looking. Hat tipped low, eyes taking measure of the house, the yard, the woman moving between them. Then another, later. By evening, the talk had already reached town. At the general store the next morning, voices dipped when Ruth stepped inside. Not quiet enough to hide, just enough to mark the change. "Blake's got help now," someone said near the flour sacks. "Help," another repeated, not agreeing or disagreeing. Ruth took what she needed, set coins on the counter, and waited for the clerk to count them twice. Outside, a man leaned against the post, clean shirt, boots polished. He straightened when she came out. "Miss Walker," he said, like he had known her longer than a day. She paused. "Samuel Price," he offered. "I keep the mercantile down the street." "I've seen it," she said. He smiled, easy and practiced. "If you're looking for steadier work, I can always use a reliable hand. Indoor, regular hours." Ruth held his gaze. "I've got work." "For now," he said, still smiling. "Dust Creek can be uncertain." He tipped his hat and stepped aside, leaving her the path. Back at the ranch, Colt was at the trough, checking the water level. He didn't ask about town. She didn't offer. The second sign came at dusk. The trough ran lower than it should have. Colt frowned, crouched, ran a hand along the inside edge. Dry line higher than yesterday. He stood, eyes moving toward the far ridge where another man's land began. "Something wrong?" Ruth asked. He shook his head once. "Not yet." That night the wind picked up. Boards creaked. A loose shutter tapped a steady rhythm against the frame. Ruth lay awake on the narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen, listening. Bootsteps crossed the yard sometime after midnight. Not hurried. Careful. She sat up, held still, and waited. The steps past the house moved toward the fence. A moment later, a dull crack, wood giving. By the time the sky lightened, Colt was already out there. 2 posts had been pulled loose, not broken clean, worked at, deliberate. The cattle had drifted close to the line, restless. Noah stood beside his father, quiet for once. May stayed on the porch, hands wrapped around the railing. Ruth walked out with a bucket of water and set it down near the trough. Colt didn't look at her. "Go back inside," he said. She didn't move. He drove the first nail in hard, then another. The sun came up slow over the ridge, lighting the dust that hung in the air between them. Ruth picked up a second hammer from the ground and moved to the next post. Colt glanced at her then. Not approval, not refusal. Just a look that held for a second longer than before. The kind that said he understood what it cost to stay. By mid-morning, the fence stood again, not stronger, but standing. Ruth wiped her hands, dust and sweat marking the lines of her palms. She looked out across the field, then back toward the house. Nothing had been said, but the question had changed. It wasn't whether she could stay. It was what staying would take. The days settled into a rhythm that didn't ask permission. Morning came with the sound of boots on hard ground, the low shift of cattle, the scrape of a chair across the kitchen floor. Ruth rose before the sun most mornings, not because she had to, because the house felt different when she did. Coffee sat on the stove longer now. Bread cooled on the counter instead of being eaten standing up. Small things. Quiet things. Colt noticed them without comment. One evening, the wind dropped altogether. No dust, no movement. The kind of stillness that made every sound carry. Ruth stood at the sink, hands in cool water, watching the last light settle across the yard. Colt was outside, leaning against the fence, hat pushed back, not working. He stayed there longer than usual. Later, when the children were asleep, he came in. He didn't sit right away, walked to the table, stood there, one hand resting on the back of the chair, like he was deciding whether it belonged to him. "I need to say something," he said. Ruth dried her hands slowly, turned to face him. He met her eyes, then looked down at the table for a moment, as if choosing the words from a place that didn't offer many. "I don't need help around the house," he said. She didn't answer. "I need someone who can stand here," he went on, his voice steady, "when it gets hard." The silence after that stretched longer than the sentence itself. Ruth felt it settle in the room. Not heavy, just real. "I'm not asking for tonight," he added, "or tomorrow." He looked at her again, direct this time. "I'm asking if you see yourself staying, for good." No movement, no reaching across the table, no promise hidden in the tone, just the question. Ruth held his gaze. Outside, a loose board shifted with a soft knock. "I hear what you're asking," she said. That was all. He nodded once. "That's enough for now," he replied. He stepped back from the table, giving the space back to the room, to her. The next morning came like any other, but something had shifted. Ruth felt it in the way she moved through the house, in the way May watched her a little longer, in the way Noah started a sentence, then stopped, as if waiting to see if it was still his place. By midday, the sun sat high and hard overhead. Ruth walked into town alone. The mercantile door opened with a soft bell. Samuel Price stood behind the counter, sleeves neat, ledger open in front of him. He looked up, unsurprised. "Miss Walker?" he said. She stepped inside. "I've been thinking on what you said," she told him. He closed the ledger, careful with the page. "And?" he asked. Ruth rested her hands lightly on the counter, not leaning, just there. "I want to understand what you're offering," she said. Samuel smiled, not wide, certain. "A place that's settled," he said. "A roof that doesn't shift with every change in the wind. Work that stays the same from one week to the next." He paused, letting the picture sit. "No trouble," he added. Ruth nodded slowly. Outside, a wagon passed, wheels grinding against stone. "And in return?" she asked. Samuel's smile didn't change. "You keep things running," he said. "You stay." The word landed softer than Colt's had. "Stay." Ruth stepped back. "I appreciate the offer," she said. He inclined his head. "Take your time." She left the store and stepped into the heat. The town looked the same buildings, same dust, same people moving through it. But the lines between things had sharpened. That evening, the air cooled faster than usual. Ruth sat on the edge of the porch, a piece of cloth in her hands, mending a tear that didn't need mending. May sat beside her, legs tucked under, watching the needle move in and out. For a long time, neither spoke. Then May said, very quiet, without looking up, "Papa don't sit outside at night no more. When you're here." Ruth's hand paused. The thread caught for a second before she pulled it through. She didn't answer. The light faded, one color slipping into another until the yard turned gray. Later, in the small room off the kitchen, Ruth lay awake. The house made its usual sounds, wood settling, a faint step outside, the soft shift of someone moving in the yard. She listened, not afraid, just aware. The question Colt had asked didn't leave. It stayed there, steady as a heartbeat, not pressing, waiting. Ruth turned onto her side, eyes open in the dark. She knew the answer. That wasn't the trouble. The trouble was saying it out loud, because once it was said, it would belong to her. And everything that came after would, too. Morning broke thin and pale over Dust Creek. Ruth was already dressed when the first light touched the window. She moved quietly through the kitchen, set the kettle on, then stopped with her hand resting on the back of a chair. The house held still around her. No footsteps yet. No voices. She stepped outside. The air carried a faint chill, the kind that didn't last past sunrise. The yard stretched out in front of her, fence lines catching the early light. Beyond that, the land rolled dry and wide, like it had no intention of ending. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to. Then she walked. Not toward the barn, not toward the well, toward the road. By the time Noah came out rubbing sleep from his eyes, she was gone. Colt found the gate open, just enough to notice. He didn't call after her, didn't send for her. He closed it, set the latch, and went back to the fence line with the same steady rhythm he had carried the day before. By mid-morning, word had already reached town. "She left," someone said outside the mercantile. Samuel Price stood behind his counter, hands resting on the wood, listening without reacting. Ruth passed the boarding house without stopping. The owner glanced up, surprised, but she didn't slow. She kept walking. Past the general store, past the church, past the turn that would have taken her to Samuel's door. The road bent just past the last building. From there, the Blake Ranch sat in clear view. She didn't rush, didn't hesitate. The sun climbed higher as she walked, burning off the last of the morning cool. By the time she reached the gate, Colt was at the far end of the fence, hammer in hand, working the same post again. He saw her, stopped, waited. Ruth stepped through the gate and closed it behind her, the latch falling into place with a small, final sound. She crossed the yard until the distance between them was no longer something that could be ignored. Colt set the hammer down. "What changed?" he asked. His voice held no edge, just the question. Ruth stood facing him, dust settling around her boots. "I'm not here because I got nowhere else," she said. The words came steady. "I'm here because I choose this." The wind shifted lightly through the grass. Colt watched her, not searching, not measuring, just taking it in. A few seconds passed, then he nodded. Once, that was all. No reaching for her, no promise spoken out loud. Just the kind of answer that didn't need anything added to it. The trouble came anyway. By afternoon, the water in the trough had dropped again, this time faster. Colt checked the line that fed from the shared channel. Dry. He straightened, eyes moving toward the ridge. "Whitaker," he said, almost to himself. Ruth didn't ask, didn't need to. By evening, a wagon creaked up the road. Old Ben Carter climbed down, slower than he used to, a barrel strapped behind him. "Figured you might need this," he said. Colt stepped forward. "Didn't ask for it." Ben shrugged. "Didn't say you did." Martha Keene came the next day with a sack of flour and a jar wrapped in cloth. Left it on the porch. Didn't stay. Didn't explain. The work didn't get easier, but it didn't feel as heavy. Ruth moved through the house with a different pace now. Not careful. Not testing. Certain. She cleared the corner of the yard where the old garden had dried out. Turned the soil with a shovel that bit harder than expected. Broke it anyway. May followed her, hands dirty, asking questions she didn't always wait to hear answered. Noah talked the whole time, about horses, about fences, about things that had nothing to do with anything and everything at once. Colt watched from the fence line. Sometimes he said something. Mostly he didn't. One evening, Ruth sat on the same step she had taken when she first arrived. No suitcase beside her now. Just the boards under her hands, worn smooth by years she hadn't been part of. The sky stretched wide above the ranch, colors settling into each other as the sun dropped. May ran across the yard, her hair tied back clean and even. Noah's voice carried behind her, explaining something with the full certainty of a boy who believed every word. Colt stood by the fence, arms resting on the top rail. He looked at the house, then at Ruth. Their eyes met. No smile, no gesture, just recognition. Ruth leaned back slightly, resting her hands against the wood. The air felt different here. Not lighter, just shared. The wind moved through the grass again, softer now. And for the first time since she had stepped off that train, with nothing but a worn bag and a number in her pocket, Ruth didn't feel like she was holding everything by herself. No one said they were happy. No one needed to. It was enough that they were no longer alone inside it. Do you want me to revise or expand any chapter further? If you had been sitting on that same step, with nowhere left to go, would you have stood up and walked back the same way Ruth did? Not towards safety, not towards certainty, but towards something that asked more of you than you were ready to give. There's a quiet kind of courage in that, the kind that doesn't look like a grand decision. It looks like a woman turning around before the road disappears behind her. It looks like a man leaving space instead of making promises. It looks like two people choosing to carry something together, knowing full well it won't be easy. Some folks spend a lifetime picking what's safe, and there's no shame in that. But every now and then, life puts something in front of you that isn't safe, just right. And the truth is, you don't always get a second chance to turn back and choose it. If this story stayed with you, I'd like to hear what part felt closest to your own life. There are more stories like this waiting just ahead. Quiet ones, honest ones. The kind that don't rush past you, but sit with you a while, like an evening on a porch that finally feels like home.